Welcome to SAQA seminar. Our topic for 2020 is color, how we see it, how we understand it, and how we use it as artists. We're so fortunate to have David Hornung as our guest lecturer today. David is a painter and collage artist whose work has been widely exhibited in the United States and the United Kingdom. He is the author of Color, a workshop for artists and designers published by Lawrence King Publications Limited, a textbook that has been translated into 6 languages and is used in art schools and private studios around the world. David has held teaching positions at Indiana University, Skidmore College, the Rhode Island School of Design, and Adelphi University. He is represented in Woodstock by the Elena Zhang Gallery. Welcome, David, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Okay.
My pleasure.
Before we show your lecture, which has been pre-recorded, I have a couple of questions for you to help our audience get to know you. Mm-hmm. How did you come to focus on color? Was that planned, or was it an outcropping of your own artistic work? Can you tell us a little bit how your journey, how you got there?
Sure. Well, an outcropping of my own art. When I began painting, I would say seriously when I was 15, and I went to art school, and in art school I became more interested in color because my own work. I was told I had an innate sense of color, and I kind of pushed on that in my own work. And then the third year of school, I studied a color class with a guy who studied with Joseph Albers. And at Joseph Albers, the large silkscreen book that he did at Yale, we had it at the college I was at. And I spent many hours studying that. And then later, when I became a college professor, this was back in the early 80s at Skidmore College. I designed a color class, so basically that's where it came from. I mean, color's been a lifelong interest in me in terms of my work and also in terms of teaching. So I guess that's the answer. Yeah.
Okay. So you brought this up about, color being an innate ability. How do you feel about that? How do you address those? I know that some people say, color is innate. Either you got it, color sense, or you don't. How do you address that?
Okay, the question is about innate, whether, okay. Mm-hmm. So this question of, do people who have an innate sense of color need to understand color? Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard to give a short answer to that. Like Vincent van Gogh, who I think we all would agree is a great colorist. Mm-hmm. He couldn't paint at night because of where he lived and when he lived. Mm-hmm. So he would sit by candlelight at night with a big piece of cardboard and put small yarn. He had hundreds of pieces of colored yarn that he would arrange and rearrange on the cardboard to study the interaction of color. So clearly, if it was good enough for Van Gogh, it should be good enough for anybody. Another way to look at this is, in all my teaching, I had students who came in with a very strong sense of color and really beautiful color in their work. They end up being the students who are most grateful for the course because it makes you, for one thing, it kind of affirms something you already know or in a different way. I remember when I first learned about the tripart structure of color through reading about Alfred Munsell, who was a color theorist in the 19th century. And I found it so liberating, even though I was already using color pretty successfully. This idea of the 3 parts and thinking about all 3, it kind of expanded the range of my possibility. Even people who have a good sense of color tend to repeat themselves, and they tend to go back to the colors they like, and even the proportions of the colors they like. And as a result, the expressive aspect of their work is sort of starved for information in a way. So I really believe that learning doesn't interfere in any way with what you bring to the table naturally.
Now, I noticed in your presentation that you show 2 or 3 quilts, and you are very well known in the quilt art community. Are there special considerations in regards to color that textile and quilt artists need to be aware of?
Well, I touched on this a little bit in the lecture because, I mean, a lot of the people I know making quilts now do their own dyeing.
Mm-hmm.
If you're dyeing fabric, you're actually working with cyan. You're working with translucent color on fabric and not using white. There's no white pigment. It's basically the density of the dye determines the lightness or darkness of the dye job.
Mm-hmm.
But quilt makers and well, textiles, there'll be weavers, quilt makers, and surface designers, basically, we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I would say weavers and quilt makers tend to work with fabric that is a fait accompli. Even if they've dyed their own fabric, when it comes to making the quilt, they're not thinking in the same way. They're looking at a red piece of fabric that is red. It's a red surface that they're going to work into the design. So they're really working with reflected light, and they're really working with red, yellow, blue as the primary triad. Quilt makers have one serious limitation when it comes to, well, this isn't exactly true because there's all these ways you can create these sort of nuanced dye patterns and stuff, and shibori and things like that, for example, and get all, so maybe this isn't really true, but I'm talking about like making quilts like the Amish made them, mm-hmm. With flat color. It's very hard to have an infinite number of colors at your command. You know, quilt making, you're necessarily starting with a limited palette, even if it's 200 colors, mm-hmm. compared to, say, a painter who can mix any color on spec at any time. You're kind of limited. So I think what's really imperative for quilt makers in particular, and probably weavers too, is to learn about the interaction of color, mm-hmm. and to learn how to make the most out of a few colors that can even be used repeatedly in a piece, but in different contexts. So to me, that's probably the most specific thing I would say. But otherwise, all the theory that I teach applies to anyone who uses color on a two-dimensional surface.
Okay. I think that's also the reason why many textile artists are now incorporating painting into their quilt, because of exactly what you said. Yeah. Is that there is a finite limit. And indeed, if you're working with commercial fabric, there's even a subset of what colors are being used in commercially that year, which restricts your range even more. Right,
but I would say the limitation is not a drawback, though.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of the most exquisite textile designs historically, like in the 18th century and 19th century, are 12 colors, literally 12 colors that have been used ingeniously. You can make great art with no color. So it really doesn't hamper you as an artist. It's just it's sort of an aspect of textile construction. That's all I would say.
And sometimes, restriction breeds creativity.
Yes,
you
like
have
playing
to
tennis with a net, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, thank you so much. So with that, I will ask you a question about the exercise. In the exercise, you've been generous in providing an exercise that I hope our viewers will take to heart and do. We will be having at least one feedback session where we can get together over Zoom and talk about the session and share what you've done as a result of this exercise. In the slides, David, you say use magazines. Our viewing audience will probably have access more easily, particularly since we're quarantined right now, to fabric. Can they do that exercise with fabric, and do you have any caveats about that?
Yeah, you can do it with fabric. I would suggest doing it on a slightly larger scale. So what I suggest, if you're using cut paper from magazines, I think it was 7 by 7 inches, something in there, 5 by 7. If you're going to do it in fabric, I would suggest doing it on a piece of cardboard or cardstock that's 8.5 by 11 or 12 by 12, something in that range. It's just something about the bulkiness of fabric that I think you'll get more out of it if you make it a little larger.
Okay, great. So is there anything else you'd like to say to our SAQA audience today?
Not really.
Okay.
It was a pleasure. You know, I'd like to see some samples if people do things and send them to you. My name is David Hornung, and I welcome you to this color lecture. Everything I'm talking about in this lecture can be seen in the latest edition of my color textbook, Color: A Workshop for Artists and Designers. And the third edition just came out in September. The book can be found easily online. So the title of this lecture is How Color Works, and I'm going to talk to you about a little about the way color is perceived, how we actually see color, and then we're going to move to the structure of color. We're going to talk about some basic color terminology, and with lots of illustrations, and then we're going to talk about works of art and how our color terminology can be applied to those. So starting with part one, seeing color, we're going to cover just some rudimentary physics of color optics just to set the table for the later discussion. And some of this stuff I'm sure you're very familiar with. This, for example, we see color because of cone-shaped and rod-shaped receptors in our eyes that line the retina. If you look at this diagram here, you can see the cone cells and the rod cells. And you'll notice that the rod cells actually outnumber the cone cells. Cone cells are for the perception of color, and the rod cells are more based on the amount of light that your eye sees. They don't perceive color. So each cone cell is sensitive to visible wavelengths of light that correspond to red, green, or blue. And if you look at the top here, you can see this spectrum. This represents the visible spectrum, color spectrum that we can see. It goes from ultraviolet all the way over to infrared. Outside this zone is invisible to us. And it's interesting to know that we only have blue, green, and red cones, even though we can see infinite other colors. There are two kinds of color theory. One is called additive, which is a theory that applies to color and light. And the second is subtractive color theory, which applies to reflected light or pigment. As artists, we really work with subtractive color. Most of the color that we see in the world is reflected or bounced back to our eye. The people that are interested in additive color theory are generally lighting engineers and people that do things like stage lighting. So this is just a diagram, what I would call an elementary school diagram of the way we see color, very simplified. The idea being that you have a yellow lemon, and you can see the full range of color from infrared to ultraviolet, striking the lemon. All the colors except yellow are absorbed and we don't see. But the molecular structure of the lemon is such that it bounces the yellow part of the light wave back to our eye and we see color. We see color in the mind. Now this is actually a more accurate version of what happens. In the world, there is no color, actually. Color exists only in our minds. So the light wave, which contains these vibrations, each color has a different set of vibrations, a different rate of vibration, strikes the molecular surface of the lemon, and the lemon segregates that part of the light wave that comes back to the eye and triggers the perception of yellow, which interestingly is the result of red and green cone cells that are stimulated simultaneously. They create the sensation of yellow in our minds, and we see quote unquote yellow. Other animals have eyes too, and their eyes are set up differently. So they see a yellow lemon differently than we do. I think every species has a vision that is compatible with their survival needs. So this is a diagram of the primaries in light color, so RGB. If you've ever worked with Photoshop, that'll be familiar to you. RGB is one of the setups with which you can create color. Another was CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So in light color theory, the primary triad is based on each of the types of cone cells, red, blue, and green. White light occurs when all three are superimposed at equal strength, or when all three types of cone cells are triggered simultaneously. So if you had a blue, a red, and a green spotlight, and you train them on one spot in the center, all three, you would get this white light, you get full light. Interestingly, when you have the combinations here, like red and green makes yellow, red and blue makes magenta, and blue and green makes cyan. These secondary colors, these are primaries out here, these are secondaries. In light color theory, the secondaries are the primaries in subtractive color theory. Another thing about light is that light sources tend to favor certain parts of the spectrum. So daylight at midday is probably the fullest range of color temperature that you're going to get. Fluorescent light, the kind of light you see it in the lavatories of rest stops and highways, fluorescent light, very cool. Supermarkets often have fluorescent lighting. Favors the cool part of the spectrum. And colors like green and blue and violet look vivid under fluorescent light. Colors like orange and yellow look duller under fluorescent light. And then incandescent light is the traditional light bulb of a reading lamp, and it favors the warm side of the spectrum. So colors like yellow, orange, and red look more vivid under incandescent light, while colors like blue and green look a little duller. The midday daylight gives you the best balance. Most colors look vivid under daylight at midday. So, excuse me, in the late 19th century, Claude Monet painted over 30 versions of the facade of Rouen Cathedral. He basically experimented with the way light changes on a surface at different times. And you'll notice that the cathedral is basically a white structure. I think that's important because he could have, if he had painted a black building, he wouldn't have gotten nearly as much variation in his paintings. Here are 10 of his variations of that same, and he went back to the same building and set up his easel and painted it in different lighting conditions. And you can see how different times of day and different atmospheric conditions, different kinds of weather would transform the facade of this building dramatically. Of course, he's not a camera and he's not shooting it in 1/64th of a second. It's really a protracted period of painting time. So there's a great deal of interpretation involved, and the light is changing as he works. A camera would give you a more accurate rendering of these lighting conditions if you want to be scientific about it. But it's pretty interesting that Monet, in that period in history, decided to make the subject of his painting the act of seeing. That's really unprecedented. So now we're going to move on and talk about the structure of color. And this is what's really important to you as artists, a way of thinking about the way color is put together and ways of manipulating color and manipulating parts of color independently. So here we have the primary triad on the left, a light, the one we looked at earlier, the light primary triad, which is red, green, and blue. And you have the overlap, the secondary colors, yellow, magenta, and cyan. And then the interstices of all these together is white. Over here we have the primary triad in pigment or reflected light. And here the primary triad is cyan, magenta, and yellow, which you'll remember are the secondaries in the light example. The overlap, or the secondary colors,
um, with magenta, cyan, and yellow are green, blue, and red. And then at the center, when all the colors are combined, you get a dark gray moving toward black. And a color that it doesn't have a real discernible hue. While the primary triad in additive color theory light is RGB, red, green, blue, in subtractive theory, it's cyan, magenta, and yellow. In a general study of color for studio practice, a nominal primary triad of red, yellow, and blue is more practical. So what I mean by that is, even though cyan, magenta, and yellow are the true primaries, that is, all the other colors can be mixed from them, the only place that really uses that is when you're using transparent color. So printing, for example, printed inks are transparent or translucent, and they fall on a white surface, and there is no white ink. The lighter colors are always the result of a less dense application of color. Dye colors are like that too. When you dye a fabric, there's no white dye. The lighter colors are because there's a less strong concentration of dye on the fabric, and the color of the fabric shows through. But for understanding color, we work with opaque colors. And this is the kind of color that most painters use. Designers, people that work with gouache use this. If you're finding color, if you're a textile artist and you're finding color, you're finding it as reflected or opaque color. If you dye fabrics, while you're dyeing, you're thinking in terms of translucency. But when the fabrics are dyed and you start putting them together in a quilt, you're actually reading them as opaque color. So color theory is more practically based on opaque color. This is another reason I'm showing you the complementary pairs with the two different systems. This is the red, yellow, and blue system, which we use to study color theory. And in the red, yellow, and blue system, you have oppositions of complements, blue and orange, red and green, yellow and violet. And as you move to the center, you'll notice that the center color is a dark, dull color that's kind of a neutral. In the cyan, magenta, and yellow complementary pairs, it's not the same. In fact, you have a problem here with blue and yellow. Magenta and green are complements, and this seems similar to red and green. Cyan and red are not. They generate violet at the center, and blue and yellow generate green or a yellow-green. So the idea of complements, which are a really important concept, central to color mixing and color understanding, isn't very reliable in this system. The other problem with the CMY system is the color wheel. The color wheels are extremely useful as a way of conceptualizing hue relationships. So on the red, yellow, blue color wheel, you have violet opposite yellow, red, orange opposite blue, green, blue opposite orange. And if you'll notice, the increments of each color are in even steps. And notice too the nomenclature. Blue, blue, violet, violet, red, violet, red, red, orange. Very simple, basic color names. You don't see avocado on there or any of the commercial color nomenclature. So this is really a very useful way to organize hues. Red, yellow, and blue are the primaries. Secondaries, equidistant. The identity of orange is that it has to be exactly between yellow and red in character. Likewise with green, between yellow and blue, and violet, between red and blue. Going over to the CMY color wheel, you can see that, first of all, ultramarine and yellow are complements, which is what gives you green at the center. Also, you'll notice that if you squint at this wheel, these colors are really not evenly distributed, nor are the reds. There's a kind of a bunching up. And notice the color naming. Ultramarine, purple, cobalt blue, cyan, yellow, and magenta are the primaries. turquoise. And in fact, if you look up any number of CMY color wheels, you'll find that the color naming is very inconsistent. Cobalt blue here might be something else entirely in another CMY color wheel, whereas the RYB color wheel is always consistent. So now we're going to move on to color terminology. And this is really the most important part of the lecture for you. And I think it's the part that you'll be able to actually use in the studio. So the three fundamental color attributes are hue, value, and saturation. Hue and value are universal names for those characteristics which we'll describe. Saturation is sometimes called chroma, sometimes called intensity. The reason I use the term saturation is because Adobe has adopted saturation and uses it throughout all their software. So I think saturation is probably the best contemporary term for this quality. Almost no one uses chroma anymore. That really came from the early 20th century from the color theory of Munsell. So let's stick with saturation. I also like saturation because it actually describes what it is, which you'll understand when I get into that later. Each of these three parts of color can be manipulated independently via color mixing or changing contexts. So we're going to break it down now. We're going to talk about each of the three color attributes. Hue is the name we assign to a color based on its location on the color spectrum. When we refer to a color by name, such as orange or green, we're referring to its hue. And actually, we're only referring to its hue. And that's the most common way of thinking about color. When people tell you something was a certain color, they usually start by describing hue. They'll say something like, this apple is red. They may, in talking about a delicious apple, they might call it dark red because the color of a delicious apple is actually a darker value. But hue is basically the name of a color. And this represents the hue continuum, basically going from infrared to ultraviolet. Ultraviolet would be out here, infrared would be in here. So all the hues that exist in the world exist on this continuum. And it's a sliding scale. And you can see, you can locate red, yellow, blue, violet, green, the primaries, the secondaries, the tertiaries. Again, this is an illustration, so it isn't a true representation, but it gives you a good approximation of the hue continuum. Another way to think about the hue continuum is to organize it in terms of a circle. And this becomes ultimately the color wheel. So you see the same colors organized in this direction. By doing it this way, we can talk about the concept of cool and warm. So the color circle can be divided into a warm zone and a cool zone. And where this comes from, I think there are a lot of ideas about this. My favorite, I guess, is that it's kind of hardwired into us as human beings because we have these associations with fire and ice that go back probably to the caves. But the idea of warmth in color is a temperature that almost becomes a metaphor, like warm qualities like passion and cool qualities like analysis. These are connections that all of us make and actually are very useful even intuitively as we work to make art. The hue continuum, when it's graduated into 12 parts, becomes basically the common color wheel. And this is the most useful way to think about colors. So if you think about, we go back to this, let's do a musical analogy. If anybody here understands the difference between a violin and a piano. On a violin, there are no frets. So you could theoretically make any possible tone on the violin. Whereas on the piano, you have a keyboard that's divided into steps. And the steps are organized according to what's called a diatonic scale. So in a way, the hue continuum, when it's graduated this way, is like a piano keyboard. This shows you 2 bars, one warm, one cool. Within each primary color, you can also talk about warm and cool. In red, for example, the extremes are crimson and scarlet. So crimson is a cooler color than scarlet. Within red, now of course red, all reds are warmer than any violets. But if you get into a limited palette, for example, if you're working monochromatically with reds, and you expand the hues to include crimson and scarlet, you're actually simulating the full color wheel in terms of temperature in that context. In yellow, the poles are yellow light, which we think of as like a lemon yellow, and yellow deep, which is kind of the yellow of a daffodil maybe, or maybe something even deeper with a little more red in it. In blue, on one side, there's cyan, which is the warm color, and on the other is ultramarine, which is cool. Okay, now we're moving on to the second component in color, and it's value. Value is the lightness or darkness of a color. It's the only one of the 3 color attributes visible in achromatic settings, like a black and white photograph or a grayscale model. So if you've ever seen a grayscale, I'm sure you have, a grayscale only deals with value. A black and white photograph basically subtracts value from a full color situation. Value is the same as luminosity. This is important. Luminosity is the quantity of light that's reflected from a surface. So we all know that white clothes reflect heat and light. Light is heat. And dark clothes absorb heat and light. So it's true of all colors. Darker colors absorb more heat and light. So violet, pure violet, is less luminous than pure yellow, because yellow is lighter and reflects more light. The more light is reflected, the more luminous the color is said to be. Now here's the value continuum from black to white. And it's just like the hue continuum. It's an eternal sliding scale that can be infinitely subdivided. Here's the piano version. The value continuum graduated into 11 parts. It's commonly called a grayscale. Interestingly, you'll notice a little color interaction situation here. Look at this gray surround, which is consistent, but see how it seems to shift as it moves against the right-hand side of the grayscale. This has to do with color interaction, which we're not going to talk about in this lecture, but if you really get into studying color, that becomes a very interesting part of color study and something you might want to think about in your own work. So this is an 11-step scale. There are sometimes 10 and 12-step scales. The advantage of the 11-step scale is that it has a midtone. If you think about it, a 10-step scale wouldn't have a color or a tone in the middle. This is a grayscale version of the color wheel, which shows what I would call the home value of pure colors. So pure blue is darker than pure blue-green, and pure blue-green is a little darker than green, and so forth toward yellow. Grays that have no discernible hue, these grays here, they don't look reddish, yellowish, or greenish. They look kind of like dead. They have no hue. They're called achromatic. They're achromatic tones. They're actually not colors, because they lack the other 2 components of color, the other 2 attributes. Saturation is the relative purity of a color. Now, saturation is probably the most difficult concept for people to grasp, especially separating saturation from value. That takes practice and basically just practical experience. You'll get it. It's an easy thing to understand in terms of definition, but it's a harder thing to actually build into your physical understanding of colors. it basically measures the relative purity of a color. The purest colors are those that resemble the colors on the spectrum, as revealed by a glass prism or a rainbow. The colors on a color wheel are all pure, bearing in mind that pigment can never be as pure as light. These are the most saturated colors. This is a saturation continuum. You can make saturation continua from any two opposing complements. So in this case, orange and blue. Orange on one side, pure orange on one side, and pure blue on the other. Again, this is an illustration, so you have to kind of accept the fact that the blue looks tinted. It looks like it has white in it. It's not really as pure as it could be, but you have to just look at this as an illustration that's not quite perfect, but perfect enough to give you the idea. So if you intermix the two poles in steps, you get an increasing breakdown in saturation. The color, as I move to the left from pure blue, becomes less, it's still blue, but less saturated until I get into this zone where it starts to shift towards something like a neutral, something that's a mixture of both, maybe a little more blue on this side and a little more orange on that side. And then we come out the other end, moving back toward pure orange in increments. So you might say the subtlest colors are in here, and the most strident colors, the brassiest, strongest colors are on the end. This is the piano version of the piano keyboard version of the saturation continuum. And what we do is we break it down into three categories of saturation. Prismatic color at each pole, which basically means the color in the prism, or the purest color on the spectrum. Muted colors, which are rich colors that have been adulterated by intermixing, in this case, cross-mixing the two prismatic colors. And chromatic gray. Chromatic grays are subtle colors that are, they feel weak in hue, but nevertheless still discernible in hue. So for example, this really is orange. This is orange and this is orange. If you look at this color, you probably, if you just saw it like a sweater in this color, you probably wouldn't call it orange, you would probably call it brown. But in fact, it is a species of orange. In the center, I've put an achromatic gray bar, basically to represent the idea that if you perfectly match the two ends at the middle in equal visual strength, you would actually extinguish the hue identity of the colors. So that's kind of an important theoretical thing, but it's not something you're going to do practically. So here's another indication of these three levels of saturation. Prismatic colors at the top, this represents the purest color. Muted colors, chromatic grays, and achromatic tones. So you can see that these chromatic grays, you probably wouldn't call these grays normally. The term gray is commonly applied to cool, very dull colors. Most people would call these grays, but you could also have a very dull color that's a little bluer than this, for example, and people would identify it as gray. Warm chromatic grays tend to be identified as browns in common parlance. So there's a difference between the word gray and the word chromatic gray. This is really important. This has to do with the range of these levels of saturation. So prismatic colors and achromatic tones are absolute. But beginning with the brightest muted colors all the way over to the subtlest chromatic grays, there are infinite degrees of saturation. So basically the category of muted color and the category of chromatic gray, which are adjacent to each other, there are infinite tones within those categories. But within prismatic color, there's only one possibility, and that is pure color. The line between muted color and chromatic gray is therefore a little negotiable. Where does muted color end and chromatic gray begin? Yet the two categories have a distinctly different psychological feel. Muted colors can be described as soft and rich, while chromatic grays are more subtle and at their outer extreme have only the whisper of a specific hue. And this goes back to what I was saying about the word gray. In common speech, the word gray usually refers to cool chromatic grays and achromatic tones. The word most people use for warm chromatic grays is brown. In color terminology, there's a distinction between achromatic tones, as seen in grayscale, and chromatic grays, which are subtle tones that have discernible hue. The term chromatic gray applies to subtle colors that are either warm or cool. Now, this is a color wheel that I made for my classes, and it's different than the traditional one in that it also shows saturation and value. So basically, starting in the center with the prismatic colors and reaching outward, what I try to do is maintain the value of the home color. So the value of pure yellow is very light. So as I go to a muted color and chromatic gray and achromatic tone, I try to maintain the same value. Likewise with red, as I go to muted color, chromatic gray, and achromatic tone, I try to maintain the same value. Of course, muted colors in red can be as light as pink or as dark as a very dark, rich red. They don't have to be the same value as the original. I just made it that way for this to demonstrate all three factors of color in a single color wheel. In terms of conceptualizing color, what this is all about and what is really going to make you a colorist is if when you think about color, you think about color as three-part. Most people that work with color, and I say this from experience, teaching thousands of color students over the years, most people think about color in terms of this and this. They think about color hue, the hue of the color, and they think about the value of the color. They generally don't think so much about saturation, at least consciously. So I always use the analogy of juggling. Thinking about color in terms of these two things is like juggling two balls. Not that difficult. It's when you add the third ball, the juggling becomes more difficult. But if you can juggle all three balls, how much more impressive that is, and how much more useful a tool that is for the colorist. So the three tools, the three matrices that I recommend are the primary and secondary triad organized in your mind in this kind of star-like configuration. Value, you don't have to think about the 11-step value scale. Just have in your mind dark, medium, and light as a way of thinking about these colors. So it's either a dark red, a light red, or a medium red. And then saturation, think about prismatic, muted colors, and chromatic grays. Among the most important things to understand is that hue, value, and saturation are independent of each other. For example, the pair of color below, the hues are the same, yellow on the left and green on the right. In each pair, the yellows are lighter in value and the green is darker. But on the left, the green is more saturated. See that? Whereas on the right, the yellow is more saturated. This demonstrates the independence of hue and saturation. These two pairs demonstrate the independence of hue and value. On the left, the blue is darker than the orange. On the right, the blue is lighter than the orange. This is an orange. It's tinted, which means it has white added to it, but it's in the orange file on the color wheel. And this is a heavily tinted blue. In art, colors are usually seen in groups, and groups of colors can be defined in terms of their range of hue, value, and saturation. Here are some examples. This group of 6 colors are all chromatic grays. They have a broad hue range because you have green, violet, yellow, blue, red. I know that's kind of hard for you to see right now, but this is actually red. It's in the red file, it's in the red family. So this is broad hue range, broad value range, but narrow saturation range because they're all chromatic grays. Here, chromatic grays again, with a broad hue range, the same degree of range we have in the previous example, but narrow value. All the values in this are in the mid-value scale. they're all the same value. As you'll notice, when values are close, the borders between shapes are rather difficult to see. In this group, all muted colors, broad hue range, broad value range. The darkest color approaches black. It's not as dark as black, but it's dark. And the lightest color is yellow, and it's almost toward white. Here, again, we have muted colors, broad hue range, but a narrow value range. Here we have a broad saturation range. So you have chromatic grays here and here, muted colors here and here, and prismatic colors here and here. This may be a muted color, a very bright muted color. Broad value range. Again, we have a broad saturation range. Chromatic gray, muted color, muted color, muted color, prismatic color. All these colors are in the same value range. So I know that was a lot to take in, and usually when I teach my workshops, we spend a week working on getting these terms down and doing exercises that will inculcate the terms. So this kind of lecture is almost like a hailstorm of information that you really shouldn't worry about not being able to assimilate all at once. But I wanted to give you the overview of the kind of thing that you would want to know as artists if you want to become more active and mindful of your color in your work. The third part of this lecture is about applying these color descriptions to works of art. And basically looking at this Amish quilt, we can talk about it in terms of what I was just talking about, the range of hue, value, and saturation. So this piece has a narrow value range, and I made a black and white version of it on the side. You can see that if you were thinking in terms of a grayscale, all of the colors in this piece are down in the lower end of the grayscale, all the way down to black, probably up to maybe the third square at the most, maybe only the second square. The hue range is very narrow. It consists of two colors, red and blue. The browns you see here, these are red. Remember we talked about that? So there's no color here but red and blue. The saturation range is kind of moderate because the reds here aren't prismatic, although they look very vivid in this context. The blues and the reds, they're highly saturated muted colors. They're muted colors near prismatic colors, but they're not fully prismatic. And then, of course, these browns are chromatic gray. And this is basically black, which is not a color because it doesn't have hue or saturation. But it works to emphasize the design by providing a dark linear element. Let's move on. Another traditional quilt. In this case, there's a broad hue range. In fact, it encompasses the three primaries, red, yellow, and blue. It has a broad value range because it goes, well, it uses black for one thing, but the darkest blues are fairly dark too. And you can look over here and see the black and white version. You can see that the value range of this piece is quite broad. And the saturation range is broad. If you look at the colors, red, almost pure, almost pure. These are chromatic grays in here, chromatic gray. And there are some muted colors, like some of these lighter yellows I would call muted. This is a muted color. This is a muted color. This is a muted color. So the broad hue range, broad value range, and broad saturation range. Now this is a modern piece by Margaret Boys-Wolfe, and it's got a narrow hue range. It's basically what we call an analogous color relationship. So in this case, I put the color wheel next to it and I've isolated the colors that she's using. So she's really relying on only this section of the color wheel. So it's a relatively narrow hue range. There's a broad value range, And there's a broad saturation range. You see some really rich greens. The most saturated colors are the greens. You see a lot of muted colors like these rusty reds and oranges, not reds, but oranges. Some of these rich kind of turquoise colors. And then chromatic grays. So you can see this reddish brown, it's kind of a green blue gray here, a bluish gray, a bluish gray. A piece by Dorothy Caldwell. It's interesting talking about the color in this piece. It's got broad value because it goes from very dark brown, almost black, to almost white. It is interesting, that is actually not white. I know that because I did an eye drop in Photoshop from it, and it's this color here. And you can see next to the white that it isn't pure white, but it functions as white in this piece. The hue range is fairly broad. You have green, orange, red, and blue. So red, blue, and orange are complements, and red and green are complements. This red is a crimson leaning toward red-violet. So it's a broad hue range, but it's kind of a subtle piece because 90% of the colors are chromatic gray. All these, what we call browns or orangey browns, are all in the red-orange family, an orange family. And it's basically this much of the piece. If you see this, this is a bar graph that breaks down the color information in this piece. So these colors you see as basically the background for most of the piece dominate. And then this little piece here represents that. And this little blue piece represents that. The white represents the white string around. This represents these colors here. So this is a kind of a distillation, I would say, of the color content in this piece. And what's interesting to notice as an artist is how Dorothy has made important decisions about proportion. It's not just the range of the hue, value, and saturation, but it's also the proportion of the colors she's using. Like she's really tipping the balance heavily in favor of chromatic gray. If you think about this, again, using a musical analogy, it's a lot of quiet playing with a few accents that are a little more heavily struck, but nothing as heavy as like a pure green. If this were a piece of music, it would be like a Chopin nocturne. These are two pieces by Elizabeth Brandt, and I think they're a really good example of pieces working in what's called a dark key. They're very dark, but they're very different. The difference being the saturation range. In this piece, she's going all the way up to a prismatic color for her accents. And there's chromatic grays, and then there are almost like, well, I would call these achromatic. This one's pretty blue though. This kind of an achromatic tone that she's worked in this, but in kind of transition. So you can see this is slightly warmer than this and also darker, lighter, not darker, lighter than this. And very elegant the way she's organized these accents and proportionately organized them. The same idea of a dark quilt with lighter accents, but this is almost, there's almost no hue in this piece. I mean, just the subtlest, like I would read this as kind of a greenish gray, and this is kind of a brownish gray, which means obviously in a warm side. This has a taste of violet in it. You see the difference in temperature between this and this. And if you can read temperature in a gray, it means it's chromatic. So there probably aren't any achromatic tones in this except for the blacks, but the colors are very, very subtle. And one thing to pay attention to is the psychology of these two pieces. How this piece feels psychologically compared to this piece. I would say this piece, and maybe you'll agree with me, maybe not, this is a more somber piece. It has a little more of a sense of distance, almost like memory, whereas this piece, it's more vivid, it's more present, it's more active. Even though it's dark, I wouldn't call it somber. It almost has like a folk art quality to it. This is a piece by Shelley Bernard Baird, and this is an overall cool temperature. I would say this piece has there's a lot of color in it, and there are warm colors because red and yellow are warm. But if you look at the yellows she's using, and you look at the red she's using, she's tending toward the cool side. Like this is the lemon yellow, which is a cooler yellow, and this is more toward crimson. You don't really see an emphatic scarlet, for example. You see no oranges. So the overall feel of this piece is cool, and yet there's a great variety of color. And again, psychology, the psychology of the piece. The overall temperature of a piece has a lot to do with its effect on you psychologically. So this is a very, I would say, kind of conceptualized piece. It's very, it kind of radiates kind of sophistication and visual intelligence, but it doesn't, it's not, for me, it's not a high dudgeon of emotion. It's more like a person collecting specimens from a culture. If an anthropologist were a butterfly collector and cultural artifacts were butterflies, we have all these butterflies stuck on this surface, these little examples taken from this culture. So finally, I want to give you an assignment that you might want to try at home. And this is it. Basically, get 4 pieces of stiff cardstock or bristle board. Each piece should be around 5 by 7 inches. If you make it square, I would say 7 by 7 or 6 by 6. Then using color cut from magazines, try to use solid colors only, incidentally. Create 4 simple designs. Each design should have no fewer than 4 or no more than 10 different colors. Of course, you can use a color more than once. Use a glue stick to affix the pieces to the cardstock. There should be no white of the page showing in the finished designs. And then you want to create a different color atmosphere in each design. Select your color mindfully, thinking about hue, value, and saturation. I'm going to show you some examples of what you might do. So these are all examples from a design workshop that I taught, and we were using exclusively color taken from magazines. So these are just cut from the backgrounds of ads. Again, try to get the most solid color you can. So I'm not going to comment too much on the color content here. I will say, in this case, clearly the person was working with the idea of chromatic gray and subtle value relationships. There's another example. The one bright note, which is almost prismatic, probably not quite, against these more somber chromatic grays in the background. A very dark example with one strong accent. So you can tell the person had a color idea in mind when they made this. That's what I want you to do in this assignment, is to have a color concept that you force the designs to obey, and then try to make something really expressive out of it. It's another one. This is a monochromatic study in yellows, broad saturation range, right? So you have chromatic grays, muted colors. We'll call this a prismatic yellow. Okay, so you have a wide range there. The values are kind of close, especially in the top part. It's another way of organizing your designs, is to think about grouping kinds of value. So kind of darkish mid value to a lighter value at the top, all the colors here being close in value. You see how we can use these terms, hue, value, and saturation, to meaningfully discuss color. That's another advantage. And there really aren't that many color terms that you need to learn, but it really will liberate your conversation, and you'll be able to talk about color in a very concrete way. 2 more examples. Keep the designs really simple. I would say try not to get pictorial, just stick with simple shapes, squares, triangles, rectangles, rhombuses, trapezoids, circles if you like, half circles, diamonds, etc. Another example. Now in this case, I threw this one in because this person is using somewhat textural, which if you want to play with that, that's cool. It's still a color exercise. I wouldn't get much more textural than this. The beauty of this is you don't really recognize specifically what it is so much. I mean, obviously this is grass, but basically this is an out of focus something. But it does give you a little bit of the simulation of using prints and fabric to work this way. It's a person using circles. Basically, red-green complements. You can think in terms of hue relationships. Try one just using complementary colors. Monochrome, analogous. And this is a more elaborate one, probably more elaborate than you'd want to get right away. But you don't have to stop at 4. I mean, if you really find this interesting, you can pursue this. So I just want to say goodbye, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
When you're used to teaching people in front of you, right? There's nobody there, and I was never so aware of how much I depended on reading the audience to see how things were going. It's
Are you teaching
really
courses Are you teaching a course online?
No, I'm not teaching. I do an Exploring Contemporary Art program for SAQA. I have no art background whatsoever, although I've been a crafter all my life, and I only got serious about textile art like in about 2000. And I had this hesitation of calling myself an artist. So once a month, we pick an artist and we pick some resources and we discuss it. And the whole thing is that this is not meant to be a rigorous art history type situation. This is to make people like me comfortable talking about art and just to become familiar.
Well, you know, 20 years is a long apprenticeship. You've been doing this for 20 years. That's a long time. There are people younger than that, believe me. You know, and the idea of not having a formal training really isn't that important. What's important is that you make things and you have a passion about it, and you'll develop, you know, I hereby say that you can call yourself an artist.
And I do now. I do now, which is why I felt it necessary to sort of pay it back, because there's so many that come into SAQA who come with that same thing. You know, you came from the traditional quilt background or whatever. Well, I'm not really an artist. Yes, you are. You just have to have the confidence to say you are.
Yeah, and you make things, and
you make things.
I mean, there are people that think car mechanics are artists. So hey, call yourself an artist. You know, really.
Right.
But you know, I think that's interesting because I work with I do a lot of work with textile artists in these workshops I do, and it's interesting because most of them are women, and women are so much more humble than men are, as a rule, and they're sort of self-denying in a way, you know. And the thing I've discovered is most of them come to me. They're like 50 or older. They spent their life making personal sacrifices for their families, and the idea of having the time and the space to actually make something of their own, it's like it's almost frightening for them.
And guilt-inducing.
Guilt, that's it. You know, and I spend most of my time, the most important thing I deal with is trying to get rid of that guilt thing. You know, more important than teaching them about color.
Right.
You know, is to just own what you make and stand strong by it, you know?
I mean, one of the things that we did way back when I first got involved with SAQA, we would have show and tell, and inevitably people would get up there and start apologizing and picking out every fault that nobody in the universe would see. And we got to the place where you said, before you said anything, you had to stand up there, put your hands on your hips and say, damn, I'm good.
Yeah, exactly. You know, that apologizing thing is
yeah.
I always say, never make excuses for your work. Or I always tell my students, don't put your work down because other people will do that work for you. You don't need to do that.
They're lining up out there.
Let them do that, you know?
Accumulating competencies really doesn't address that. It's like, if I can accumulate more competencies, somehow that will, it's like it's an external thing when it's really an internal thing, staking your pole in the ground, saying, I'm an artist because I make art.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
It's nice to meet you, and maybe we'll cross paths sometime. And
I sure hope so. I mean, I would love to be able to take a workshop with you sometime.
well,
And I'm
hopefully,
envious of the people who've had that opportunity.
well, I want to get back to it. I really can't wait for this to be over.
Yeah.
I have 4 or 5 that have been not postponed for a year, and even this year, it looks like I don't think May is going to be soon enough for the vaccine to really be fully operant.
Right, right.
So maybe another year, but we're not that old. You're certainly not. I feel I'm 70 years old. I feel like I've got another good 20 in me.
I don't feel, I don't feel my age. And even when I looked at the generation before me, I just, the expectations have changed, thankfully, of what it means to be 70 years old, which is great. Nobody's expecting me to sit around in a rocking chair, I don't know, doing whatever it was. So the expectation has changed. And I think our health has changed for many people, not everybody, but for many people.
The lucky one. We're lucky.
We're
And as long as
lucky.
you have your health, you feel 25. That's the way I feel.
Right. Of
I
course,
don't look 25, but I feel 25.
well, the mirror and my joints occasionally give little reminders, but for the most part, yeah, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah, you are. You are.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's been an absolute delight. This conversation didn't go where I thought it was going. I've enjoyed it immensely. Our audience is so fortunate to have this. And again, I totally thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you and to do this.